Hello and welcome to my channel. In our lives, we are constantly on the lookout for godly leadership, people that we can depend on, that we can follow, that we know are strong leaders, and we certainly value people who are followers of God, people who hear God, who know God, and who we know most of all that we can depend on, especially as we navigate difficult times. And we're going to talk about that in today's video. So good morning to everyone. My name is Waynell Henson. Many of you know me as that Sunday school girl. And for more than 5 years, coming up on 6 years now, I've been in this space changing the way that people see Sunday school. And we are here today to review our Sunday school lesson for Sunday, March 6th. We'll be looking at the lesson titled Moses, Prophet of Deliverance. Now, some of you are on with me live, and I've been doing this for about 3 weeks now just because I love y'all. My life is crazy. And so my time has been a little bit challenged with being able to do pre-recorded videos and edit and upload. But I remain committed to this community. And I remain committed to providing the lesson review video, even if I have to do it in a non-traditional way. They taught me this way: Sunday school never says fail. And so I do not intend to fail in my commitment. And I have to admit, I'm almost kind of starting to like this. So I don't know where we may be going. It's always exciting to switch it up and do things a little bit differently. But that said, if you're a person who still prefers our Sunday morning format, I still go live on Sundays at 9:45 a.m. Central Standard Time. So for this video, think of it as just a teaching video. If you are at work or whatever, turn this off and watch it later like you would on a regular Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, because this is just a lesson review and I will not be engaging as much in the comments. Although I do see you, Sister Korniki, and I do see you, Sister Barbara and Sister Carmen and Mom Harris. I see you all are on, and I'm glad that you're here to hang out with me for just a bit. Before I get into the lesson, let me give you just a couple of updates because we're in a new quarter. And as we go into this new quarter, I kind of want you to know what you can expect from me in the month of March. It is always my intention to not just provide these lesson videos. I love God because when I started, that's what I did. I did 6-minute videos to review Sunday school lessons. And now he has allowed this community to become so much more. And so there are these review videos, but there's also amazing training and connection and fellowship. And if you are one of those individuals who is looking to continue to develop as a teacher, a leader, a Christian education leader, and you're in the space serving people, this ministry has so much more for you than these lesson review videos. So first of all, I want you to know that the Step Summit 2020, why am I still saying 2020? And this is what happens when I pre-record videos. We start over. Step Summit 2021 is coming up, and I've already posted the save the date for you. The dates are September the 17th and 18th of 2021. And I want you to be there. So be on the lookout because on March 15th, the registration will open and there will be a 2-week window where there will be an early bird special. And I want you to take advantage of that. So make sure that you're on the watch out for it on the morning of the 15th when that site goes live. I want you to grab it. If you enjoyed it last year, you know it is going to be explosive again this year. There were more than 400 people who joined for Christian Education Sunday School Leader Training. This is the premier ministry leader training conference in Christian education. So I want you to be in this space with me. In the meantime, if you just cannot wait until September because you know that the training is so good, I also want you to know that there is an amazing group that's called 2-Step, and that's our continuing education group. And what is 2-Step? 2-Step means that I'm your partner all year long. It's not a conference. It's not an event, but you are literally a leader who wants to grow and develop, and you want to do that on a continuing basis. So the link for 2-Step is down in the description box. Check it out. The community is amazing. It's separate from the regular TSSG community. There is a private group on Facebook. I interact with that group. I drop freebies in that group. I go live in that group, and we meet once a quarter for 2 hours. That's where the two-step comes in. And I personally do the training in that time. The conference, I share my time with amazing leaders, but in two-step, you're stuck with me. So if you're interested, check out the link. I want you to be there and get ready for this year's conference. So let's go ahead and get into today's lesson. I want you to make sure that you have everything that you need, that you got your pens, your Bibles, your journals, your commentaries, handy dandy notebooks, whatever it is that you use. And by this point, you should be ready to review the lesson with me. I also want you to know that the TSSG notes, my personal study notes, are in the description box down below, and you can grab them at any time. Our lesson this week is entitled Moses, Prophet of Deliverance. The Bible basis is Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 22. The Bible truth: Moses speaks to God's people. Our memory verse is verse 15, and the lesson aim is that we will evaluate Moses' role as a prophet of God in leading the Israelites out of Egypt, reflect on leaders who guide us through seemingly impossible situations, and completely rely on God in resolving challenging situations. Now, we are going, as I told you, into a new quarter of study, and we're looking at the prophets. And when I think about prophets, not just a definition of what prophets are, but literally I think about prophets in their spaces as leaders. And I think a lot about what it means to be a godly leader. So you'll probably note that I will pull a lot of leadership nuggets out of this series. And actually, as I was preparing to make this video, I have to confess, that's one of the things that sort of slowed me down in this lesson, because I know that God helps me to see the lessons in different ways. And I am never satisfied just knowing the tactical parts of the lesson. I am never satisfied just knowing what the lesson means. And so I was asking God to show me the other spaces where I really can allow this lesson to resonate in me and hopefully share that with you as well. And so as we go into this quarter study on prophets, faithful to God's covenant, I think it is an amazing segue coming off of this discussion. We just had a series on the call of God, and we looked at New Testament study, and now we go back to the Old Testament, but really, again, looking at men who were called of God, who honored that call to be the mouthpiece of God. And that is a huge thing. And we'll talk about that because prophets, at least Old Testament prophets, they weren't popular people. So we'll talk about what prophets are and kind of develop this conversation over the next 12 or 13 weeks, whatever we have in this series. So for this week, we are in the book of Deuteronomy. We're in the book of Deuteronomy. And really, this is the story of the Israelites as they come out of their time of slavery in Egypt. The purpose of this book, in my estimation, is really a change in mindset, right? So God delivers his people from Egypt, and they spent 400 years plus in slavery. And there is definitely something about a mind that has always been controlled, an environment that's always been controlled, a people that have been taken advantage of. And so now that they are a free people, a delivered people, they need a leader who is that person who helps them to know what God would have for them and how they were to be and how they were to live. And that chosen individual was Moses. Now, Moses is a man who has had a very interesting life. I mean, from the time he was a child, like going back to even his mother having to hide him on the river, he has always had something that was trying to snuff out purpose in him. And he's moved around a lot. But at this point, and I want to focus just for the purpose of this lesson, at this point, he is obviously a man who has grown into this incredible leader. God has used him and uses him in this role to deliver his people. This is Moses, who stuttered at one point, who had no idea how God was going to be able to use him in this way, to go take big messages, to speak truth to power. Now he is this strong leader. He is someone who has advocated for those who were marginalized. But most of all, he was obedient and he was faithful to God. So in our passage, he is in Deuteronomy, he's addressing the Israelites. Now, at this point in this book, he is near the end of his life, and they are preparing to enter into the promised land. Like, they can see it. And yet they know, and Moses knows, that he is not going to enter the promised land with them. Now, I kind of wanted to get grounded because I think it really matters. The leaders that we have in transitional times matter. The leaders that we have when we're facing the really scary things, they matter. And so Moses is that individual. But I thought about this too. He literally is the only leader they have ever had. From the time that they were delivered, in this time period, it's at this point more than 100 years, 130 years or so, that they have known his leadership in some way. And now, even in this transition, this 40-year transition, getting to the promised land, God has used him as their deliverer, as their leader. And thinking about what it would look like in the time of transition, what happens when this leader is gone, I am sure has to be an interesting space. And I'll talk about that in just a bit. But again, Moses knows that he is not the leader that will go into the promised land with them. And at the same time, even though he knows that, and I love this about Moses, I won't make it with you, but I am so responsible. I am so committed. I love you so much that I want to make sure that you know what God would have you to know and be prepared in the ways. And most of all, he always wanted them to remember what the Lord had done for them. And he helped them with that through teaching them to observe. We talked about the Passover a lot in our daily readings this week, but literally putting those practices into place that would always be a reminder of God's grace and his deliverance. Moses also knew this, that just because he wouldn't go over, he knew that God's people would still need guidance. They were going to need someone who would help them to hear. And so as he is talking with them in this particular passage, in this chapter, there are really three big ideas. And although we focus on the prophet, the promised prophet, the first thing he shares with them, though, is that y'all are covenant people. He wants them to know that you are not like everybody else. You are different. And they needed to know that before they got into the promised land. Why? Because when they got there, there was going to be all sorts of stuff there that they were going to have the opportunity to be a part of or not be a part of, things that they were used to, not used to. In other words, they were going to be in the world, but not to live like the world. They're not of the world, just like you and I. But he wanted them to know over there's going to be witchcraft, there will be mediums, there will be psychics, there will be people who are consulting the dead. And they were not to do what those people were doing. They were not to follow the customs of the land. So the divination, the fortune telling, God said no to that. And they were to depend on God alone. The big idea is you are different, and we are not to conform to the world. The second piece he gives them is the promise that God is going to give them a prophet. And the third thing is to beware of pretenders. And that really takes us into the heart of where our lesson has us this week. In verse 15, we begin where it says, the Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee and of thy brethren like unto me. Unto him ye shall hearken. Verse 16, according to all that thou desirest of the Lord thy God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, let not me hear again the voice of the Lord my God, neither let me see this great fire anymore, that I die not. So now Moses is again helping them through transition. And I want you to be very conscious and careful with who you allow to lead you through transition. What do they see? What do they know? How do they hear from God? And so as Moses speaks to the Israelites, I label this a very comforting yet a curious promise. It was comforting yet curious. And what did I mean when I said that? Well, the first thing I see is that he makes a promise. I know that it's a promise because it uses the words, the Lord will. And whenever we see the Lord will, the Lord shall, we know that it is going to happen without question. And when God gives us a promise, we should be comforted in his promise, comforted in knowing that he will not leave his people uncovered or without a leader, comforted because he loved them enough to give them consideration for what was up ahead. And yet it was curious because who could be a better leader than Moses? Who could be better than the one who led them out of slavery? Who could be better than the one who God spoke to through a burning bush? Who could be better than a man that talked to God directly? Who would be better than the man to whom God gave the law, the ways they were to live? Who could be better than a man who tapped a rock with a rod and water began to flow out of it? And who could be better than a man that would lead them and there would be quail and manna, like provision every day? Who could be better than a man who would part the Red Sea, right? And so when you look at that, that is very curious. And I can imagine, again, as they're going through this transition, that is a big idea. And so looking at this transition, the Lord, if you think about this, he gave them miracles and Moses led them through very difficult times. But it was the Lord that they needed to depend on. It was the Lord who gave them the miracles. And it was, they needed to hear from God, to know that God still had him on their mind. And so God is revealing a lot about himself to his people. He reveals that he is still on their side, that he will watch for them, that he will continue to have relationship with them. And so he says that he will give them a prophet. What is a prophet? A prophet is the mouthpiece of God. He was going to raise up a mouthpiece. Now, when I think about prophets, prophets speak the voice of God. Prophets speak, or God speaks through prophets to his people. God speaks through prophets, but his goal is to speak to his people. And I always reflect on this idea that God wants relationship and he will use what it takes to get the message to us as his people. Now, the distinction in this passage for me was, it's not that a person, when I think about the role or what a prophet does, because we popularize prophets, they talk about God is going to give you a car, God is going to give you a house, and if you do this, God is going to do that. And that's not exactly what God had in mind here when he was looking at how to get these very powerful messages to his people. One distinction I see with biblical prophets is that they weren't people who had their hands up like, pick me, pick me, pick me. I want to be a prophet. Being a prophet looks like it'd be really cool. No, God chose his prophets and he made them. So here in this passage, it says that God will make this individual a prophet. And what would be different about them? Like, they would be chosen by God and not a part of that mixed culture that we talked about. So they would not be led by divination or led by the dead, but truly this individual would be from God. Why would God send them a prophet? Why do they need a mouthpiece? Because again, just like you and I, the Israelites were always looking for answers and they were always needing some guidance. And so when they heard the voice of God, even the time they heard it for themselves, it was more than they could handle. And so Moses became this individual who was that go-between for them and God. There was also this issue of false prophets, and that's what we see in verses 9 through 14, that false prophets, there will be people who speak and they speak words that they say. They may sound good. There are people who will speak and they speak for other gods, but those are false prophets. And we're going to talk about that because God knew that and his people needed to know the difference. So here are the three distinctions, though, that would let them know that this was God's prophet versus any other. The first is that this prophet would be a singular person. And I noted that. Notice that God says, I am going to send a prophet. Verse 15 says a prophet. This is a singular individual. Again, there were lots of prophets in the Old Testament. This was not unusual. There were literally hundreds of prophets in the Old Testament, but Moses is now setting the expectation of a particular individual that would be identified in a very unique way. In fact, we know, or you may not know, this is pointing to Jesus. The prophet that Moses is talking about is pointing to Jesus. And it's interesting because even when John the Baptist is on the scene, They asked, are you the prophet? Not are you a prophet, but this very conversation sets the tone for looking out for the prophet that God promised. The second thing is that he would come from among you. He would be an Israelite, meaning coming from the brethren of the Israelite group. And then finally, he will be like me. He will be like Moses. And there are so many ways as we look at the life and even the stories as children between Moses and Jesus, children who from their very birth were threatening and who from as babies, their lives were in danger. As children, they were taken into Egypt. Like there are so many comparisons. So when Moses says he would be like me, but also that individual who would manage that relationship between them and God. And in many ways, Jesus, and we'll talk about this, he was the greater prophet because he wasn't just a manager of a relationship, but he was the ultimate one who would reconcile that relationship. So instructions to the children of Israel that they were to listen to the prophet. And again, there's an imperative here. You will listen to him. And that's a must. When God gives us instruction, we are not able to negotiate that. It is not for us to think about the parts that we like and don't like. He's saying, no, you will listen to the prophet. Now, here's what's tough. Prophets, again, at least the Old Testament prophets, typically didn't have easy messages. They were the things that were tough to digest. Often their messages were messages of correction or to bring change and to align God's people back to his ways. And so they weren't necessarily popular people. And when they shared God's instruction, they shared it with particularity in very specific ways and letting people know that God required obedience. And so his people were to listen to him to know what he required. And in verse 16, he's letting them know, you ask for this. At one point, God on Mount Horeb spoke to his people, and it was more than they could handle. In fact, they said, we don't want to hear his voice again like this. It was so much because the manifested presence of God included a voice and thunder and fire. And it was so much. Even after Moses spoke with God, when he came back down, he had to cover his face. Interaction with God was a lot. And so the people asked for this. They needed someone who could speak to God and bring the message back to them. In verses 17 and 18, the Lord actually responds. And he says, they have said what is right. Why? Because they can't handle me directly. They know that they need this. And so God affirms this promise that he would indeed, and there's repetition in this passage, that he would indeed raise up a prophet that would come from their brethren, and he would indeed be like Moses. And his function would be as the mouthpiece of God. God says this, I will put my words in the prophet's mouth. And here's the obedience piece again. You are to do what he says. And again, this is all pointing to Jesus, looking again at their similar backgrounds and their similar life experiences. The lives of Moses and Jesus are mirrored in so many ways. But Jesus is the ultimate prophet. And we will see that as we continue to read. In verses 19 and 20, it will happen. It's going to pass. That's what the scripture says. But then there's a warning that sits inside of here. There is a warning because they need to be aware of competing messages. And you and I very practically need to be aware in our current context of competing messages, that not everyone who speaks and not everyone who sounds good and not everyone who is charismatic is sent in the name of the Lord. They are not all speaking in the name of the Lord. And he was trying to help them to understand how to know the difference. Because as we look at this passage, there is accountability, right? There's the accountability of the people that we are to listen, or they were to listen to the words of the prophet, or there would be consequences. And let's talk about those consequences as we look at what it means to receive what God sends. When God sends a word through his prophet, and namely when God sent Jesus, when he sent the ultimate prophet, to reject the words of the prophet is effectively to ignore and to reject God. In our daily readings, we were looking at even the Passover, and there was a part of the instruction that said everybody who is capable of attending the Passover, everybody who is capable of remembering God and being in this space, but you choose not to, that would mean being cut off ultimately. And so looking at this same accountability, that when we have the word from God and we are able to hear it and perceive it, and we choose to reject it, we knowingly reject God himself. And God tells his people that there would be consequences because ignoring God brings death. And what does that mean? Could it mean literal death? Possibly. But I think very practically for you and I, that death is actually that separation from God, that when we knowingly ignore the voice of God and when he's speaking and when he sends us word, we put ourselves in a place of isolation and separation. And ultimately, we have no ability and no right to have an expectation for God to move on our behalf when we knowingly and consciously and intentionally reject him. And so there's an accountability of the people to hear and to obey when God sends his word. And on the contrary, there's also an accountability of a prophet. The prophet, who again is presumed to be the mouthpiece of God, must speak what God says. Now, again, there were many false prophets, and the issue with false prophets isn't really that they speak for other gods. The issue with false prophets was those who represented other gods, who would dare to say that they spoke in the name of the true and living God. The issue with false prophets, even today, is those who will say, the Lord said, and God said. In fact, let me just insert this. This is not in my notes. There are lots of people saying that God said, and just don't know that God is talking this much every day to all these people. He didn't talk to the children of Israel for 400 years. And so it's amazing that people so often lead out with what God is saying. We need to know, a prophet needs to be sure that God has said a thing. Why? Because God says that to speak otherwise in my name brings consequences, and to speak in the name of other gods, this would all mean death for false prophets. So being accountable to God, the prophet, the mouthpiece of God, it's not just a charismatic gift. It's not just to impress other people, but a prophet has the accountability to God. And here's what I love about having accountability to God. It's not just in the words that they put out, but in a way, the best way I could describe this is that being accountable to God and worrying only about what God's response is removes the prophet's responsibility to impress people. When the prophet is only speaking what God says, the prophet is dismissing what people think, how people feel, and it frees the prophet to minister in truth. And so a prophet's accountability, a leader's accountability is to God. And when the leader remains committed to God, whatever that leadership role is, I'll make it even bigger than that. When we as leaders stay accountable to our responsibility to God without worrying how the people feel about it, it keeps us free to operate in truth. Verses 21 and 22. I'm sure the people wonder, if there's this prophet coming, Moses is going to be gone, how will we know? You know, there's this ultimate prophet that's coming. How will we know that individual? How will we know that they are sent by God? How will we know the difference? How will we know when God is spoken versus man? How will we know when it is God's prophet versus pagan witchcraft? How will we know? And there are so many witches in the earth. Even today, we have to know, how do we know the voice of God versus the voices of everything else going on? And oh my goodness, I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole, but there are voices today in the earth. And I need you to know that witches today don't wear black hats and pointy hats. They don't wear all black. Witches today have 20-inch bundles and beautiful makeup jobs, and they're very attractive men. And we've got to be careful and know and be able to discern the difference between what is from God and what comes from another agenda. And again, there are a lot of people who claim to speak for God, but they're actually speaking for their own personal gain. They're speaking for other agendas, other political and social interests. And we've got to be careful, even with the language. And yes, I am going to get personal. Be careful with the language that we hear today. Everybody using the word manifest is not a mouthpiece of God. That is a word right now that is so popular in the earth. Please be careful. Everyone talking about manifestation is not speaking godly things. And I got to leave that there and get back to the Sunday school lesson. There are people, and we need to know. How do you know a true prophet? How do you know the voice? Well, there is a 3-part test that is given in the lesson, a 3-part test. I think the first one is it's given very clearly. There are rules here. The first rule is that a prophet, you know a true prophet. And let me tell you this about the 3-part test. The 3-part test requires everything to be here. You don't get to choose just one part of it. So the first is that the prophet speaks in the name of the Lord. They are not simply speaking by their own strength, their own knowledge, their own will, but they speak in the name of the Lord. And when God speaks through the prophet, the second part is that there will be results. Let me go back though to part number 1. He speaks in the name of the Lord. And there will be people who again will speak when God has not spoken. The burden of the prophet is not to share their own agenda, not to share what tickles our ears, not to share what makes us get in the $100 line, but to speak only what the voice of God says. The second thing is there are results. When the prophet, the mouthpiece of God, declares that which came from the Lord, that which thus saith the Lord, there are results. What he says actually happens. The things that he says happen. So when the prophet has spoken and it doesn't happen, he has spoken out of his flesh and not as the mouthpiece of God. So I know you're probably saying, well, Waynell, the scripture tells us that there are 2 things that we must see. So that's only 2 parts of the test. Well, here's my 3rd part of the test. The 3rd part is it happens every time. Every single time when God sends a word, there is performance. And any prophet who is not accurate with thus saith the Lord is no prophet at all. And that is why Jesus becomes that ultimate prophet, because everything that he spoke came to pass. There were results every time. So identifying both parts of the test means that you and I have responsibility. If we're going to identify both parts of the printed test and then to know that it happens every time, we've got to do 2 things. You and I must be listening. We've got to pay attention. We've got to be prayerful and discerning and not so excited to just hear a word and want things to go our way and want to hear bunnies and sunshine and rainbows every day, but no, to listen to the spirit of a thing and discern whether it be of God. And not only that, but sometimes it's great to hear a word and God said it and I'm moving on. No, stay connected and watch whether there is manifestation. Does it happen? Does the word that the Lord, if they say the Lord spoke it, does what they say actually happen? And so that means that you and I cannot be passive in how we allow every voice to come in and out of our space, but we've got to listen and watch for performance. Now, what gets to be difficult in this space is just that. It is that staying connected and watching, because so often we're trying to make a decision in that moment without the benefit of time. But here, when God speaks to Moses, through Moses, he's letting them know that there is a benefit of time that comes. So we cannot be impressed with every voice that's coming through in this season. And we must know that we've got to watch. Does performance actually happen when the prophet speaks? And in this case, because this ultimately points to Jesus Christ, the prophet is fulfilled in scripture. And yes, Jesus is the ultimate voice of God. He reveals God perfectly. In our last quarter study, in one of our lessons, we looked at Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. And it says that God, who in sundry times and in diverse manners, in many different ways, we talked about that, He spoke to our fathers through the prophets. But now in the last days, he speaks to us clearly by his Son, who is appointed heir of all things, by whom he made the world. And so we have now this prophet, and that is in the person of Jesus Christ and his life, his death, his burial, his resurrection, his presence in our lives even now speaks to us. He is the ultimate prophet. This is the lesson for this week. The daily readings have been amazing. I hope that you'll go back and check those out if you missed any of them. There are so many nuggets in them. But overall, I kind of tried to give my highlight key learnings for this week's lesson. The first is that leaders are going to come and go. I'm looking back now. Many of us have been reflecting, goodness, of the last year has been so much. And I'm getting to the space now. In fact, my brother and I talked about this, where a lot of us are realizing that those leaders that we looked to, that we looked up to, that we depended on, those leaders are transitioning. And as we look to who will lead now, who are those individuals, that just affirms for us that the looking for leadership does not change, that people are always looking for leadership. But as we look, we must make sure that we're remaining prayerful and attentive. We need people. My next learning, we need people who will tell us the truth even when it hurts. If you have leaders who are never willing to tell you or call out, not just beating you up, not pulling you down, but who literally just think that everything you do, you just hung the moon every day, but they never see anything in you where you can have an honest space and get truth and know the truth of God, then be careful about that leader, because a real leader will tell you the truth even when it hurts. The next thing is that corrective change often comes through words that we find difficult to receive. Why? Because we don't like it. I don't like it. I don't like it when bad behavior or a bad attitude, and yeah, we all have it. Nobody is that amazing. But when we have that called out or identified, it doesn't feel good, but it's necessary. So corrective change often comes with words that we find difficult to receive, but a true prophet, a true leader will always give us truth. Our confidence must always remain in Jesus Christ. And even as I look at this transition of leadership, the biggest opportunity for the children of Israel was like to trust God. Like even in the midst of transition and leadership moving, and honestly, I'm in a space in my own church where we're looking for who is going to lead us. What does this look like? This is unprecedented for us. We've never seen anything like this, or at least in our lifetimes, right? We've never seen anything like this. This is huge leadership. And at the same time, it is so necessary for us to trust God and know that he has our best interests at heart and that he prepares godly leaders. And our confidence cannot be in those people, but our confidence must always remain in God. We must remember all that God has done for us. And the readings this week continue to ground us in this idea that even here as the children of Israel are moving into the promised land, there's so much for them to remember, even in transition, even in uncertain times. The one thing you can always go back to is the record of God. Like, what has he done? And what do we do? What do you do to keep a fresh memory of what he has done? A fresh memory, I promise you, will get you through some of the most challenging times. Why? Because tough times make us focus on the stuff that's tough, but a fresh memory will keep us focused on the power of God. God takes communicating in his name very seriously. So I caution you as we use our words to be careful about what God said. And when you attach those words, the Lord said, you better make sure that you heard him say what he said, because God takes communicating his voice in a very serious way. Finally, beware of those that you allow to speak into your space, and know that you will know that it's God when it's not only spoken in his name, but when it actually happens. And you'll know and identify true prophets, because it won't happen sometime. They won't have a 50% accuracy record. They won't even have a 90. But when the Lord has said it and said it for sure, it will happen every single time. That is our lesson for this week. I do pray that there was something helpful for you in it. And as always, please, I didn't even ask y'all this. I'm sorry. I didn't even tell the new, that's what happens when you're live. You might mess up. But new people, if this was your first time, welcome. You have just joined the largest cyber community of Sunday school students on the World Wide Web. There are now more than 35,000 people in this community, and we are growing through this word. And it is my honor to serve you in this space. I need everybody to make sure, oh my goodness, this is live. Make sure that you are subscribed to this channel. I don't want you to miss anything when it's uploaded. So there is this video to review the lesson, but there's also Markup Monday. This week we've been live with the home daily readings. It is just my endeavor to add value to your space as you are studying this word, and especially if you are teachers of the word, to add value in the ways that you teach. So everybody do me a favor, and yes, even if you're on the live, go ahead and click that thumbs up like button. Take a moment. Click the thumbs up like button. It doesn't cost you a thing, but it lets YouTube know that you enjoy the content. It's also encouraging to me. I will ask that you will please share this video with someone who is preparing, or maybe someone who just needs to deepen their study in the Word of God. I am trying to de-Sunday school Sunday school, because it's not about being made to come on a day at a time, but it is about getting this word and getting it in a way that it becomes real and alive and active in our everyday. So as you have studied, if there are things that you gained from the lesson, any notes that you have that you think I need to add to my notes, leave them in the comment box down below. I do see them, and I will certainly add them. I'm not above stretching and learning. That's what we do here, is we encourage each other. So I love you all so much. I will see you in Sunday school. Goodbye, everybody.
This bag makes a great gift for teachers, and of course there's a church school version as well. Visit my Etsy store for this and other great items, and look down below this video for t-shirts for all ages and sizes.
Changing the way you see Sunday school with that Sunday school.